On the morning of April 9th, 1942, the American fortress at Bataan collapsed. The skies over the Philippines glowed red as Japanese artillery hammered the last defensive lines. Thousands of soldiers and civilians were trapped. Hospitals overflowed. Morphine ran dry. Disease marched faster than any army. But inside one of those makeshift wards, a lone Navy nurse moved through the chaos with calm, steady hands. Her name was Ann Bernatitus, and before the war was over, she would become one of the first American women ever awarded the Legion of Merit for heroism under fire. Her story begins not on the battlefield, but in the suffocating heat of a hospital that had become a war zone. Outside, the ground shook with every blast. Inside, the wounded cried out, some from pain, others from fear. Infection crept through the camps like a silent killer. Supplies dwindled to scraps. Yet Bernatitus fought on with a determination that defied the dying world around her. She was one of the last Navy nurses left on Bataan, one of the few still standing. The Japanese advance was relentless. Their air power ruled the skies. Their infantry pressed deeper each hour. As the American and Filipino lines crumbled, medical personnel faced an impossible choice: flee and survive, or stay and help the wounded who could not move. Bernatitus stayed. She treated men with shattered limbs, burns, and diseases that seemed unstoppable. She worked with the roar of enemy aircraft overhead, with dust choking her lungs, with bombs landing close enough to shatter windows and blow open doors. She kept her voice steady, even when her hands trembled. But this is not just the story of one nurse. It is the story of survival against odds so overwhelming that historians still struggle to describe the conditions of Bataan without calling it hell on earth. In the closing days of the siege, as American forces prepared for surrender, evacuation orders arrived. Bernatitus was told she must escape. The Japanese new nurses were symbols of resistance, valuable, vulnerable, and dangerous to capture. Under the cover of darkness, she boarded one of the last submarines to leave the doomed peninsula. Behind her, the guns of Bataan fell silent as thousands were marched into captivity. Ahead of her lay a journey through war-torn islands, submarine torpedo runs, and the long road to survival. This is the cinematic, gripping, and human story of Ann A. Bernatitus, the woman who walked through the fire of Bataan and lived to tell the truth the world needed to hear.
The last days on Bataan were a slow, grinding collapse. Food was nearly gone. Quinine, the only effective treatment for malaria, had vanished weeks earlier. The tropical heat turned every wound into a festering threat. Men who had once marched confidently now struggled to stand. Some weighed barely 100 pounds. Others had to be carried into the wards on doors, blankets, or makeshift bamboo stretchers. Ann Bernatitus worked inside Hospital Number 1, a cluster of tents and crude wooden buildings pressed between the jungle and the shore. The hospital was never quiet. Day and night, the air echoed with coughing, moaning, and the distant thunder of artillery. The smell of antiseptic mixed with sweat, blood, and the rotting humidity of war. Nurses slept in short bursts, sometimes on the floor beside their patients. Fear became a constant companion, but it never replaced duty. The Japanese shelling intensified in early April. Aircraft circled overhead like vultures. When bombs crashed down, soil blasted through tent walls and tore open operating rooms. Surgeons worked with their hands shaking, operating by lamplight after power lines were cut again and again. Water was rationed. Even the simplest bandages became treasure. But for Bernatitus, the hardest part was emotional. She watched soldiers grow weaker by the hour. Men she had treated for weeks. Some begged her to write letters to their families. Others asked if they would make it out alive. She gave hope when she could. When she couldn't, she stayed by their side anyway. Commanders understood the truth before the public did. Bataan could not be held. Ammunition was failing. Disease had crippled entire regiments. Reinforcements were not coming. And still, the defenders refused to surrender until every option was gone. On April 8th, 1942, the order came: burn all remaining supplies. Destroy medical equipment. Evacuate who you can. Everyone else would be prisoners. The nurses were gathered and told the gravity of the situation. They were symbols of American resilience. The Japanese saw them not only as captives, but as propaganda. Capturing military nurses would be a psychological victory. Command insisted they must escape, no matter the risk. But leaving meant abandoning the wounded, men too broken to move. Bernatitus hesitated. Her face was streaked with sweat and dust. Her uniform was stained from weeks of non-stop work. She looked back at the rows of soldiers calling for help, and for a moment she felt her resolve fracture. Then the ground shook again. Another shell slammed into the hillside. Another fire bloomed across the tree line. Duty had given her strength. Now, survival demanded something harsher. As night fell, with Bataan collapsing behind her, Ann Bernatitus prepared to embark on one of the last escapes from a dying front line. The road ahead was deadly, but staying behind meant certain capture, and she was not ready to stop fighting.
Night on Bataan brought no peace. Only shadows hiding danger. The jungle whispered with insects and distant explosions. Fires glowed on the ridgelines like dying stars. As the Japanese breakthrough widened, the last American evacuation plan swung into motion. Only a handful would get out. Ann Bernatitus was among them. She was escorted through the darkness toward the coast. The path was narrow, choked with vines and slick with mud. Every step carried the weight of guilt. Behind her, thousands of wounded men remained. Ahead of her, unknown danger. The night smelled of smoke and salt water, the air thick with tension. American soldiers whispered hurried orders. Engines were kept off. Any noise could draw enemy aircraft. Their destination was a small rendezvous point hidden behind mangroves. Waiting beneath the dark water was a silent predator, the submarine USS Snapper, one of the last vessels able to slip through the tightening Japanese blockade. Submarines were not designed for passengers, especially not evacuees. Space was cramped, conditions were suffocating, but this was the only path to survival. Bernatitus boarded just before dawn. As she descended the metal ladder into the narrow control room, the scent of oil and machinery replaced the burning air of Bataan. The hatch sealed above her with a heavy metallic pang. For the first time in months, she was beyond the direct reach of enemy artillery, but not beyond danger. The submarine still had to escape. As the Snapper submerged, depth gauges trembled. The hull groaned under pressure. The lights flickered with each adjustment of the electrical systems. The crew moved with quiet precision. They knew Japanese destroyers prowled the waters, dropping depth charges on anything that moved. Bernatitus sat near the aft compartment, surrounded by sailors she had never met, but who treated her like family. Some offered blankets, others offered water. A few simply nodded, acknowledging her presence in the shared silence of fear. Above them, enemy ships searched. The sonar pings echoed through the sea, sharp metallic rings that drilled into nerves. Every man on the submarine held his breath. One wrong move, one loud noise, and the ocean would become their grave. The Snapper went deeper. Minutes stretched into hours. The submarine threaded between patrol lines, weaving through channels littered with wreckage from earlier battles. Twice, explosions rippled overhead, depth charges hammering the water. The hull shuddered. Pipes rattled. Voices went quiet. Bernatitus closed her eyes and breathed through the terror. She had survived bombs, starvation, and disease. She would survive this too. By evening, the danger eased. The submarine rose to periscope depth. The horizon was clear. For the first time since the collapse of Bataan, she felt the faint, fragile relief of safety. But the war was not done with her. Her escape marked only the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. Ahead lay further battles, new assignments, and the ever-growing human cost of a world burning. She had survived Bataan. Now she had to survive the rest of the war. The submarine delivered Ann Bernatitus to a new battlefield, Corregidor, the island fortress guarding Manila Bay. If Bataan had been a slow death, Corregidor was a storm waiting to break. The island was small, rocky, and cramped with exhausted soldiers. half-empty supply depots, and the determined remnants of American and Filipino resistance. The moment she stepped onto the shoreline, she felt the tension. The air vibrated with distant blasts. Dust hung over the island like a permanent fog. Corregidor's defenses were legendary: underground tunnels, coastal batteries, and heavy guns facing every direction. But legends could not change the truth. Supplies were dwindling. Reinforcements were gone. The Japanese wanted the island, and they were closing in fast. Bernatitus was assigned to Malinta Tunnel, the beating heart of the fortress. It was a vast labyrinth carved into the rock, dark, humid, echoing with the footsteps of thousands. Inside, nurses and surgeons worked under flickering lights as the wounded flooded in from collapsing outposts. The air smelled of disinfectant, stale sweat, and cordite drifting in from the outside entrances. Every hour brought more casualties: shrapnel wounds, burn victims, soldiers pulled from collapsed bunkers. Some carried the dust of Bataan still on their clothes. Others arrived silent, shock hollowing their eyes. Bernatitus moved through the wards with steady hands, but even she felt the weight of this new siege pressing closer. Outside the tunnel, Corregidor shook under relentless bombardment. Japanese artillery from the mainland hammered the island night and day. Shells exploded against the cliffs, scattering debris across the courtyards. Aircraft dove from the sky, dropping bombs so powerful they cracked concrete and shook equipment from shelves. The once mighty guns of Corregidor answered back, but the enemy fire grew fiercer with each sunrise. Inside, the staff lived in shadows. Sleep came in minutes, not hours. Meals were whatever could be scraped together. Water was rationed. Disease spread in the confined air. But no one stopped working, not while men were still being carried through the tunnel doors. Bernatitus treated crushed limbs, stitched gaping wounds, and calmed soldiers trembling from concussions. She learned to recognize the distant whistle of incoming shells, when to brace, when to duck, and when to keep working despite the tremors. Courage became routine. In late April, the bombardment intensified beyond anything the defenders had experienced. Corregidor shook as if the earth itself were cracking open. Reports whispered through the tunnels. Japanese troops were preparing to land. The final assault was coming. Bernatitus felt the island's pulse slowing. Corregidor had held for months, but the fortress was bleeding out. Yet even as the walls trembled and the lights flickered, she kept going, steady, focused, unbroken. The storm was about to reach its peak, and she was still in the heart of it.
The final hours of Corregidor were a brutal, chaotic descent into darkness. By early May 1942, the island fortress, once the proud shield of Manila Bay, had been reduced to a shattered landscape of broken guns, burning barracks, and men clinging to their last strength. Every rock, every trench, every tunnel wall bore the scars of non-stop bombardment. And in the middle of it all, Ann Bernatitus kept moving. The bombardment had reached a level no one thought survivable. Japanese artillery from Bataan thundered across the water without pause. Aircraft shrieked overhead, diving in relentless waves. Bombs tore open concrete, sending shards ricocheting through the courtyards. Even deep inside Malinta Tunnel, the concussions shook the lights so violently that bulbs shattered in their sockets. Dust rolled down like ash with every impact. Outside the entrances, soldiers fought in terrifying close combat. Japanese troops had landed on the eastern beaches under the cover of night, pushing through smoke and broken terrain. American and Filipino defenders fired in desperation, grabbing anything they could: grenades, pistols, bayonets, to hold the line a little longer. The ground was churned into mud and craters, familiar paths lost in chaos. Inside the tunnel, the scene was overwhelming. Stretchers lined both sides of the corridors, nurses rushing past flickering bulbs. Wounded arrived in waves: burns, shrapnel wounds, crushed limbs, faces blackened with smoke. Some were carried in by friends, others stumbled on their own. Bernatitus moved with the speed of instinct, cleaning wounds as walls trembled, steadying men in shock, helping surgeons shouting over the thunder above. Her hands were stained, her uniform torn, but her eyes stayed focused. Then word spread through the tunnel: the island's defenses were collapsing. Runners brought urgent news. Enemy troops had overrun eastern batteries, tunnel entrances were under fire, ammunition nearly gone,
communications failing. Yet the medical teams refused to abandon their posts. Offices ordered the destruction of remaining documents and equipment, but most inside Melinda couldn't leave. Too wounded, too fragile, too close to the end. Bernatitus felt the weight of that truth. She had seen Bataan fall. Now she was witnessing Corregidor crumble. Through smoke-filled tunnels and deafening blasts, she continued treating the injured until the last possible moment. Outside, the battle raged. Inside, she fought her own war, one patient at a time.
War does not end when the guns fall silent. For Ann Bernatitus, survival came with its own battles. Quieter, but no less demanding. After months of siege, starvation, and escape, her body carried the scars of exhaustion. Her uniform hung loose on her frame. Her hands trembled when she stopped moving long enough to notice, but rest would have to wait. The Navy needed every trained nurse it could spare. She was reassigned to hospitals treating survivors from the Philippines and the Pacific Front. These men arrived broken in ways that went far deeper than their wounds. Many had endured the Bataan Death March. Some had escaped sinking ships or collapsing airfields. Others carried memories they would never speak aloud. Their eyes showed the truth. Even far from the front, the war traveled with them. Bernatitus worked long hours, often through the night. She knew how to manage fever, infection, and shock. Skills sharpened under fire, but now she faced new challenges. Malnutrition so severe, bones pressed through skin, tropical diseases that lingered long after exposure, and psychological wounds for which no manual existed. Men woke screaming in the dark. Others stared at the wall, refusing to speak or eat. Some felt guilty for surviving when their brothers had not. She understood that feeling too well. Despite everything she had endured, she remained steady. Her presence alone brought a sense of calm. She spoke softly, worked quickly, and rarely showed the weight she carried. Patients trusted her. Doctors relied on her. Command respected her. But inside, she replayed the memories of Bataan and Corregidor. The shells exploding against the cliffs. The cries of wounded soldiers. The faces she could not save. Still, she kept moving forward. When the Navy recognized her courage, the news spread through the wards like a spark of pride. She had been selected for one of the highest honors an American woman had ever received in wartime, the Legion of Merit. But for Bernatitus, medals were not what mattered. The real victory was seeing a soldier sit up for the first time in weeks. Hearing a man laugh after thinking he never would again. Watching survivors regain the strength the war had stolen. Even as the conflict raged across Europe and the Pacific, she reminded everyone around her that humanity could endure, that compassion was a force stronger than fear, and that courage did not always carry a rifle. It often carried a medical kit. But Bernatitus's war was not yet over. Ahead lay new deployments, new responsibilities, and the final grinding march towards Allied victory. She had crossed battlefields, tunnels, and submarine corridors to get here. Now she would help carry others through their darkest hours, just as she always had. When the war finally began to fade, when the front lines stopped moving, and the thunder of artillery softened into memory, Ann Bernatitus stood among the countless quiet heroes who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. She had moved through the worst moments of the Pacific War, not as a soldier with a weapon, but as a nurse, armed only with skill, courage, and unbreakable resolve. The world remembered the great battles, Midway, Iwo Jima, Leyte Gulf. But hidden behind those headlines were the people like Bernatitus who fought a different kind of war, a war of infection, shock, disease, and despair. A war fought not in trenches or cockpits, but in makeshift wards lit by lanterns and in tunnels shaking under bombardment. After Corregidor's fall and the long march toward Allied victory, she continued serving with the same calm determination. She trained new nurses arriving fresh from the States, many too young to understand what awaited them. She guided them through their first nights treating the wounded, reminding them that every life saved was an act of defiance against the brutality of war. Her own story became a symbol of resilience.
She was among the first American women to receive the Legion of Merit, a recognition that carried the weight of every sleepless night, every bombed-out ward, and every wounded soldier she refused to abandon. Yet, when people asked her about her heroism, she rarely spoke about herself. Instead, she talked about the men who fought on Bataan, the doctors who worked until they collapsed, the Filipino civilians who risked their lives to smuggle food and medicine, the sailors who kept the submarines running through danger. For Bernatitus, the true measure of courage was shared sacrifice. When the war ended, she returned home with the humility of someone who had seen too much to celebrate loudly. She carried memories that would never fully fade, the cries of the dying, the rumble of bombardments, the desperate nights when hope hung by a thread. But she also carried the certainty that compassion was a weapon as powerful as any artillery gun. Her service continued for years after the conflict. She remained a cornerstone of Navy nursing, shaping new generations who would carry her lessons into Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Her story lived quietly in the background, a testament to the endurance of those who fight not for glory, but for life itself. Ann Bernatitus survived the fall of Bataan, the siege of Corregidor, and the perilous escape that followed. She stood firm when the world around her collapsed, and in doing so, she left behind a legacy carved not in stone, but in the countless lives she saved.
In the vast tapestry of World War II, her voice is soft, but her courage echoes forever.